Welcome back for day 2 of the Lilah sew along. We are ready now to put the piping on the bottom of the bodice. I would suggest you check one last time before you put the piping on and be sure that the side seams of your lining and the side seams of your bodice match up so that the bottom of your bodice fits perfectly along with the lining. So once you've done that, then flip the lining out of the way and you will start your piping just the same way that you did at the neckline, coming in from the fold line or that crease line about 1/2 inch. And I think just because it's my habit to trim my piping to 1/4 inch, I forgot that this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. So what I'm going to do is when I start my piping, I will move it up a little bit so that I get that 1/2 inch seam allowance. And so my raw edge of my piping seam allowance will not match completely with the bottom edge, the raw edge of the bodice. So after you do that, you'll end the same way on the other side, and then we'll work on the sleeves. Now we're ready for step 16, which is the beginning of the sleeve construction. And this is where, because I'm lining my sleeve, there had to be a little bit of a change in the order you do things. So I needed to go ahead and stitch the underarm seam of both the lining and the sleeve, so then I could slip one inside the other with wrong sides together, and then is when I went back then and did my gathering threads at the top and on each side of the keyhole. So from this point on, constructing this sleeve lined is the very same as unlined. So after you have done that, you will you've got a small piece of bias. So this, unlike your ties, this is actually cut on the bias because it is what will go around the keyhole. So I didn't get my bias tape maker out for this. I just went ahead. It's a 1-inch strip just like the others, and I just folded it so both edges meet in the center of the 1/4 inch fold on each side, and then I pressed it again. So now it measures 1/4 inch. And then what I want you to do is press with the bias already folded completely. Press so that you get a bit of a curve. So, and by doing that, you need the 2 folded edges at the top and the 1 folded edge at the bottom. So as you press, you're kind of stretching that bias a little bit so that it'll be easier when you actually pin it and stitch it on your little keyhole. So after you've done that, then you do open it back up, and I'm going to put the right side of my bias strip onto the inside or the wrong side of my sleeve. So I'm just going to turn it this way. So right side of my little keyhole strip to the wrong side or the inside of your sleeve, and you're going to pin and stitch. And as you stitch, you're going to be stitching in that crease that's 1/4 inch from the edge of the strip. So you'll just be able to work your way around that keyhole, and you'll probably want to put a pin about every 1/2 inch or so because you don't want that to slip as you're stitching it. So after you've done that, go ahead and, like I said, stitch in that crease. You probably can't see it here, but there is a crease there. And it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so you can also use that too. So after you've got it stitched on, then I've gone ahead and done this other one. So now I don't want you to trim any of that seam allowance away. So this is what it would have looked like when you finish stitching it, is like that. But I don't want you to trim any of this seam allowance away. So now you're going to refold your bias, which should be pretty easy to do since you've pressed it. And then you're going to fold it again so that the folded edge comes just past that original stitching line where you stitched the bias on. And I would suggest, if you've got an edge stitch foot, use that because you'll have a guide. Possibly an open toe foot so that you can see, because you want to be able to stitch close to that edge, but also just consistently close to that edge all the way around, because you are now stitching on the right side of your sleeve. So you want it to look neat. So you should be ready to do that. So we'll get both of our sleeves to this point, and then we will be back to pin our ties on. Now we are ready for step 20. So you're going to get your ties out that you've folded, and these will be for your sleeve. And if you did not mark, there are a couple of lines on your pattern piece that's for your armband tie. So you will need to mark a center and then these 2 placement lines. And so if you haven't done that, go ahead and do that. And then you will be ready to pin your armband to your sleeve. And so you'll be placing the right side of the band to the inside or wrong side of the sleeve, and that center mark goes at the underarm seam. And then that next mark, this mark, goes at the edge of the keyhole. So right like that. Then you've got this gap here, and you know that where your gathering threads start, that area will still remain flat. So you can go ahead and pin that to your armband ties. And now you've got this area where you've got your gathering threads. And I went ahead and tied the 2 top ones that are closest to the keyhole. I went ahead and tied those. So now I can safely pull from this side and know I'm not going to pull my threads out. So I'm going to pull those until it takes up that slack, and now it fits with the rest of the armband right there. So, and it usually ends up being about an inch or so of gathers right there. Not many, but you'll have the same amount on the other side of the keyhole too. Once you've got it pinned on each side, then you can kind of move them around a little bit, and so they're more even across that short area. And that's what I did to the other side too. So I'm ready to start stitching, and I'm going to stitch with the wrong side of my band up. because I want to just stitch that 1/4 inch seam. So you're going to be stitching in that little crease where you originally had it folded. So I'm going to use a edge stitching foot here. Even though I'm not really stitching on the edge, I'm stitching on this crease, but that does give me something to go by. And I'm just going to make sure that the needle hits where I want it to. Back stitch a little bit, and then as I get close to each pin, I will take my pins out. I'm going to pause just a minute while I finish this seam, and then we'll be back to finish up the armband. Okay, now I have my band stitched on my sleeve, which still leaves my ties sticking out here. So what you need to do now is refold your band and be sure that you fold in each end. The sashes, the ties for the sashes, you only had to do that on one end, and the other end was in the seam allowance at the side seam. But on these arm ties, you need to do both ends. So I'm just going to start pinning, and I'm not going to pin here very much because I'll just kind of use my fingers to refold it as I stitch it. But then when you get over to where your band is actually stitched to the sleeve, you'll need to refold there as well. And you shouldn't have to trim anything off your seam allowance. If you do, it would just be maybe where it's gathered, and maybe the gathers stick out a little bit beyond the seam allowance of the band. So then you're going to continue wrapping it to the outside or the right side of the sleeve. And you'll continue doing this all the way across the sleeve from one edge of the keyhole to the other. And I've actually got this one already pinned, ready to sew. And I'm going to use this edge foot. And you want to sew with this side up of the sleeve. So be sure that you flip the remainder of your band, your ties, so that it also is facing the same way. And then I will need to move my needle position. Looks like twice. And then I will sew right along. This is the two folded edges, just like you did for the sashes. And then in just a second, we will be up here. And then, so you will continue stitching so that you can stitch down the band to the sleeve, and it'll be that I'll still be using the same edge stitch, and it'll be stitching just barely onto the band just to catch it and hold it in place. So I'm going to continue this, and then we'll be back to talk about putting your sleeves in your bodice. Okay, now we are ready for step 22. I've gathered up my sleeve, just kind of guessing about the fullness right now. And make sure you have the front of the sleeve with the front of the bodice, and then match the side seam with the underarm seam. Kind of pinch those together until you can flip your bodice over, and so that you can continue pinning with right sides together. This is not a real full puff sleeve. You want to concentrate your gathers at the center of the armhole so that you've got about an inch or so of gathers on each side of the shoulder seam. So put a pin there. A couple more pins, and then I'm going to stitch this in. I've already done this side and tied the little bow. I like to go ahead and tie a knot at the end of the ties, both on the sashes and then on the armband ties. I think it just gives it enough weight that I think the bow hangs better. So get your sleeves in, your seam allowance is finished, and then we will be ready for the skirts and the placket. Okay, we are ready for step 23, 24, 25, and 26. It's all the placket. So I have drawn my V. Well, first of all, I went ahead and did my side seams because my skirt is lined. I wanted to be able to finish both side seams, then put the skirts together with wrong sides together, and then treat this now as one fabric. So you can wait and do your side seams in 27, or you can go ahead and do them now. It really doesn't matter. So I have drawn my V, stitched my V, and then cut it open. And then the next thing you need to do is press 1/4 inch of one long side of your placket strip to the inside, to the wrong side. And then what we will do is we'll put the right side of the placket strip to the right side of the skirt. Let's put a pin right there. Trying to do this so you can see it, but I need to see it too. So as you pin this edge of the V, when you get to the bottom or the point of the V, that's when you just barely want that point of the V to be 1/4 of an inch or just a scant 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the placket strip. And then grab a hold of a pin. Then we go back up this side of the strip, and when we get back up here to the top of the skirt, we want to be 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the placket strip again. And then maybe one more pin down closer to the point. So what you're going to be doing, you'll have some extra here to cut off, but what you're going to be doing is stitching, and you're actually going to be stitching straight. If you can see my red line there, that's where my stitching line is too, and that's what held both my skirt and my skirt lining together so I could then cut the slit. And so what I'm going to be doing is stitching starting at one end of my placket at the top of the skirt, And then when you get to that point is when you stop with your needle down in the fabric and raise your presser foot and make sure that you don't have any puckers or anything in the way that are going to get caught. And then you can just you won't have that pin there by that point, and you will just kind of move this extra fabric out of the way, and then you'll continue on up the other side. So let's get that done, and then we'll finish up the placket. Now I've got my placket strip stitched on. You can see that's pretty much a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way up, so it's a straight line, there's no pivoting. And then now I've pressed so that seam allowance is toward the placket strip, and pressed it flat from this side, and then you've got your 1/4 inch that you pressed under earlier. And then now you're going to fold and press the placket strip so that it completely covers your stitching from where you stitched the strip onto the skirt. So what I'm going to do is stitch this, and then I've gone ahead and put in my gathering threads around the skirt. So if you haven't done your side seam, do your side seam. Do 2 rows of your gathering threads, one about 3/8 of an inch and one about 5/8 of an inch, because this is a 1/2 inch seam. But I'm going to stitch just right along, actually on the placket strip, but just barely. So by stitching right there, I'll be catching the folded part of the placket strip. And then we'll be ready to gather our skirts and put them on our bodice. Okay, so before we move completely away from the placket, the last step for the placket is to put the 2 sides of the placket together, right sides together, and then just stitch right there at an angle. You can see that in step 25 in illustration letter C. So after you do that, then remember that on the right hand side, the placket gets folded back again. And I'm going to put a pin there just so I don't forget. So that's already folded back like it needs to be, and then this side remains flat. So now I'm ready to, I've gone ahead and gathered up some, I'm ready to pin the skirt to the bodice, leaving the lining loose. I'd like to start at the side seam and put a pin there. And then kind of open up where the lining attaches, and you've got that crease, which is your fold line, and that's what you place that side of the placket on, is the fold line. So I've got a pin there, and then I'll adjust my gathers so that it fits the back of the bodice, and then you'll match the center fronts. And again, when you get to the other side seam, you will match that. There it is. And you'll want to put several pins in this seam because you don't want your gathers to get pushed the wrong direction. And then when you get back to this side where the placket is turned under, you still place it on that fold where you've got a crease now on your bodice. So I'm going to go back and readjust my gather so that I can get everything pinned in place. And then you will need to put your your piping foot back on, because you're going to be stitching with this side up, and you're going to have that stitching line where you have attached the piping, and you'll be able to feel that cord there. But if you put your piping foot back on, that cord will still stay in the groove that you use, the foot that you use for your piping. So we will get this on, and I will trim this seam allowance a little bit, and then we'll talk about stitching down the lining and hemming, and we'll pretty much be done. One of the last things we need to do is to whip down the lining, the bodice lining. And sometimes I feel like it's best to, even though you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, to not turn up your lining that full 1/2 inch, especially on something that's got the fullness in the front. It could easily cause it to pull if you pulled this down too far. And so I think it's better sometimes to just err on the side of not turning it under quite a 1/2 inch, and leaving a little extra fullness right here. It's not going to hurt anything, and it'll always hang nicer in the front, especially something that has the feature like this fullness in the front. I think I will blind hem my dress, and then top stitch the hem of my lining, and finish up to stitch my lining down, stitch my buttonholes, and get my buttons on, and be back in just a little bit to show you the finished project. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the Lilah sew along. I think it's pretty sweet. I love the ties. The sash in the back is something a little different. Hopefully you've learned some new techniques, and we'll see you next time.